It's our pleasure to welcome tonight Dr. Azza Karam. She has been to Brigham Young University before, a year ago or so, but we're happy to have her with the Wheatley Institution here tonight. And again, once again, thank you to Jack Wheatley and his family for their unflinching support. Those of you who are here to attend the conference, it's an interesting thought. Why would a family decide over the course of about a decade to support the enterprise of bringing young people from all around the United States and select faculty from around the country to meet, talk together, go up in the mountains for a few days and see what they think about how they might change the world, if you will. And Jack and his son Charles are here, and if you get a chance to talk to them, fine. It just kind of, if you get a chance to look into Jack's eyes, I think you'll see what I alluded to upstairs, the feeling of faith and confidence in you as young people. So we are happy tonight for lots of reasons. Dr. Azza Karam, as has been said, serves as a senior advisor on social and cultural development at the United Nations Population Fund. And there she coordinates outreach with faith-based partners and chairs the UN Interagency Task Force on Religion and Development. I learned today that involves 17 different agencies of the UN coming together under Dr. Karam's chairmanship to talk about what do they do when it comes to religion. WHO, the UNDP, and a host of other agencies. Before she came to the UNFPA, she was the Senior Policy Research Advisor at the UNDP in the Regional Bureau for Arab States, where she coordinated the Arab Human Development Reports. Those of you that follow Middle East studies might remember early in the 2000s when she was there, these Arab Human Development Reports were small earthquakes in the social and political environment of the Middle East. And when the Arab Spring, short as it might have seemed, but it hasn't ended necessarily, people thought back, I think, about the reports that came out from Dr. Karam's bureau at that point in time. She also had the support of the Ford Foundation, where she founded the first Global Women of Faith network during her tenure at an organization called Religions for Peace. And she would also advise on interfaith development work in Muslim-majority countries. During this time, she also served as president of the Committee of Religious NGOs at the UN. She did her academic work at the American University of Cairo, Rotterdam University, and Erasmus University of Rotterdam, I guess, and also University of Amsterdam. I hope that you will feel free to engage her on topics that she mentions or on topics that you think she might be interested in based on that background. I can tell you she is eager to engage. Dr. Karam, we are more than happy to have you here, and we give you the podium. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. It's actually a wonderful privilege for me to be here with you today. So I want to extend a special thanks to BYU for having me again, and certainly to the Wheatley family, but especially to the persons who I hope are now going to be my friends, Fred and Robin Axelgard, and Fred for the very kind hospitality. And I want to do a special call out of thanks for James, because I know that he was behind that my name coming onto this arena in the first place. So thank you all very much for the privilege of having me, of giving me the opportunity to be with you here today. I have, for those of you who had to hear the introduction about me twice, I sincerely apologize. Once is more than enough, but I'm happy to use this opportunity to provoke some of you so that you'll have a chance to ask me some questions after this, because it would then make it very interactive, which is something that I love very much. That, of course, is if I ever give you a chance to ask any questions. Now, it seems that we are talking about a secular age, religious pluralism in a secular age. And my contention is that we actually have never been in a secular age. That notion of a secular age is a very ethnocentric notion. It is as if we're looking at the whole world from the vantage point of Western Europe and possibly North America. But the truth of the matter is that the rest of the world has never been secular. The rest of the world has been very much adhering to religion and religious belief, one form of religious belief or the other. And not only an adherence to a religious belief, but I think most people around the world have grown up in contexts which are deeply religious or spiritual in some way, shape, or form. The notion of secularism is very much an Enlightenment notion that came from that binarism created by Enlightenment thinking, that there was a secular and a religious, so it's just like there was a truth or a false. And the fact of the matter is that even if you look at countries ostensibly as secular as in the Nordics, Norway or Sweden or Denmark, and you realize that these institutions, they have religious institutions, the Lutheran Church, which is very much and has always been part of the state infrastructure in those countries. If you look here in the United States, I think you'll realize that for the last few administrations, prayer breakfasts are a common occurrence where people actually pay money to come and rub shoulders with politicians as a matter of course, and they're very highly valued, and it's a lot of money. Why would you have prayer breakfasts in a secular political context? And why would they be very highly valued unless there was a clear purpose behind prayer meetings? Even in very religious countries like Saudi Arabia, I'll wager you they do not have prayer breakfasts. So therefore, this entire idea that we actually have a secular age is really more a description of a reality which is contested of a certain part of the world. But it is not and has not been a reality for most of the world. So given this particular critique I have of the notion of a secular age, what has religion really got to do with it? And it's very interesting because we tend to think of religion as though it's one thing that you could sort of quantify and then address. And the fact of the matter is that religious realms and religion is a very complicated set of entities and realities and institutions and actors, and we try to simplify it as much as we can, but the truth of the matter is that the realm of the spiritual or the religious is a very wide, complex, complicated, and diverse realm, that it changes and influences cultures, and that in fact it is often inappropriate to think of a culture which is devoid of any religion. In fact, most cultures tend to be very much inspired by and interactive with their religious contexts. And if that's the truth, which it tends to be, then we cannot possibly say that that there are some parts of the world which lack culture. So the logic would go that if culture and religion are intertwined and everyone has culture, then it cannot therefore go that you would have a context where there is no culture. So therefore you cannot have a context where there is no religion. I can speak to this for a long time, but I want to take us somewhere where I have been serving. I've had the privilege of serving for a few years now, which is the United Nations. Why? Why do I want to share with you a little bit of what's going on in the UN system? Well, because I think that we're in a moment of time globally where if we didn't have the United Nations, we probably would have wanted to have it. Because we're living in an era, geopolitically, where it seems as if the Darwinian concept of the survival of the fittest seems to be the mantra of certain governments around the world, where the idea that you would actually be accountable to international norms, standards, or values is becoming more and more contested every day. And it seems more like the more powerful the nation, the more it is entitled to do what it needs to do for its own survival. And given this particular reality, it is even more imperative than it has ever been that we would have a space where nations can at least hold each other accountable and come to the same table and have the conversation with one another. Most conflicts or wars around the world begin when people stop talking to one another. Tensions are a normal part of life. What governments do in context of tension is they will, if they stop talking, they will go to war. And at this moment in time, we can ill afford a context where nations do not talk with one another. And if there's one thing that the UN system is very good at, It is to convene. It convenes as a matter of course. The United Nations convenes. And we often get tremendous amounts of grief for you're meeting and meeting and meeting after meeting. Yes, it's true. It's meeting after meeting. Again, when the meetings stop, when the interactions stop, that's when trouble begins. So, in spite, and indeed precisely because of the context of the conflicts that we have today, we need the United Nations more than ever. However, do we really understand the United Nations? The United Nations is a system. It's a set of it's like a universe called the United Nations with many, many constellations. Approximately 65 different UN entities form the United Nations system. One of those entities is something called the World Bank Group. It's one of the smaller entities in the UN system. So those of you who hear about the World Bank and the IMF and they're supposed to be a big deal, they're one little tiny cosmos inside this big universe called the United Nations. So when there's a need to critique the United Nations, it's often helpful to know exactly who you're criticizing and what you're criticizing, because goodness knows it's never going to be all 65 UN entities doing the same thing at the same time. I wish. When we work inside the UN system, few of us actually appreciate that not only do we have 65 different entities, but we also have approximately 65,000 staff worldwide, not counting peacekeepers who are easily 120 to 150,000. So it is a lot of people doing many, many, many different things. But what does the UN system have in common? It is the space where 193 governments come together. 193 governments. Now, we often make a big deal about the G8 and the G7 and the G20, and we think these are very important spaces, which often baffles me because I wonder, if you think the G20 is very important, what about the G193? Because that's what the United Nations system is. It's a group of 193. And if we think that the G20 makes a big difference, what would we think, therefore, of 193? And why do we have such an inbuilt reaction to being averse to where the space where 193 come together? Why would we undermine that? So it's 193 governments. For lack of a better word, it's potentially 193 different cultures, and each culture big enough to encompass plenty of subcultures. But in truth, however, the way that the United Nations system works, we work in a very Western context. Those of us who work in the United Nations, all 65,000 of us, actually have pretty much similar education. We all come from a similar social class. We've all studied up to a certain point in time, and all of us are fluent in at least 2 languages. One of them is English. And so the truth of the matter is that we're the elite of this world. And we've all been educated in a Western context. So the dominant culture of the United Nations system is a very Western culture. And because of that, for the longest time since the inception of the United Nations system, the ethos was a secular ethos, which is one that asserted and maintained that religion should not be part of the public sphere. The public sphere is a secular sphere. And so therefore, for the longest time, the understanding that we had of how it is that we work with religion, especially those of us based in, guess where most of the headquarters of the United Nations system entities are? New York, Vienna, Geneva, Rome. If you haven't figured it out yet, they're all Western cities. Those of us who were based in these spaces for a very long time assumed that we don't need to engage with religious actors, at best. At worst, we assumed that any engagement with religion was usually a harbinger of bad stuff. Why? Because we tended to see religion from a very tinted glasses, not rose, but tinted glasses in which the religious was the realm of men, a male-dominated realm, which tended to be very dogmatic, very authoritarian, and they were all the same and looked alike. And the truth of the matter is that just as the United Nations system is not alike, the realm of the religious is equally not alike. So what happened to help change the perception that we needed to engage with religious actors, we needed to be more savvy about religion? Unfortunately, what happened was September the 11th, 2001. That happened to the psyche of the United Nations system. And as a result, the questions began to be asked. What is this religion thing? What is happening? What do we need to do? And I come from one of the organizations in the UN system which had the only Saudi Arabian woman as an Undersecretary General and Executive Director. And she was hired in January of 2000. From January of 2000 to September of 2001, this lone voice in a group of 40 Undersecretary Generals, which is the cabinet of the United Nations system, this lone voice would go on and on about, folks, we really do need to take religion a little bit more into account. Culture, religion, it's important, these things matter. And nobody listened because they assumed she's a woman from Saudi Arabia, what else is she going to say? After September the 11th, 2001, they were all looking to see where was that person who was talking about religion again? Where'd she go? And that began, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on which way one looks at it, it began an interest inside these policy hubs in Geneva, Vienna, New York, Rome, to try to understand, okay, so what do we do with this religion stuff? What does that actually mean? And therein began the journey towards what we know today, which is the UN interagency structure or modality that tries to deal with religion and religious issues. So what have we done? How did we deal with this religion dimension? Remember, I told you religion is a much more complicated and complex realm than the UN. And the language of religious institutions is a language that none of us in a secular context really know to speak. We don't speak religion. We don't understand this narrative of God says and verses and holy books and whatever. Our sacred text is called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And some of us do refer to it as a sacred text. I don't, but some of us do. So this other stuff, all these other sacred books, is something that we did not quite understand, and we still don't. And so how then do you communicate if you don't speak the same language? And who do you communicate with? And we learned very quickly that the broad swath of Christian groups, now I am enclosing a lot under that umbrella, and we were just at a meeting the other day where a Protestant, an ordained reverend woman Protestant from South Africa looked across the table at a cleric, a Catholic cleric, and looked at him very honestly and said, "So, are Catholics actually Christians?" And so when I say Christian, I mean the whole gamut of Christians. We realize something very interesting, which is when we're looking for counterparts, who do I talk to from this community? It's much easier to identify the Christian communities. Why? Because they're organized in a pretty much easy way to decipher. There's the church, the related institutions, non-governmental organizations affiliated to the church or churches. The organizational structure of the Christian communities tends to be like us. In other words, organized in a very similar fashion to the way we would be organized in a secular context. The Vatican has, for instance, or the Holy See has an office that deals with foreign affairs, an office that deals with economy and development, an office that deals with health. They're kind of organized pretty much like a secular government or bureaucracy. But the rest of the religious realms, they're not organized like that. So when we think of Buddhism or Hinduism or Islam, we struggle to find who we are supposed to talk to. As one of my colleagues said, and this is not politically correct, if you're looking at the Hindu community, there's a guru for every neighborhood, and there's an ashram in practically every city. So who and how can we possibly engage with this multitude? Which is a very legitimate concern. Who and how indeed, in a Muslim context, which institutions would you necessarily reach out to? Because the organizational infrastructure within these different religions is not the same as ours. Ours being the UN secular bureaucratic infrastructure. So for a number of reasons, it still remains a challenge to understand how to reach out to different religious communities and who should you engage. And as a result,